And it worked. But this guns per butter trade had a cost. Now, back in 1946, the cost was nominal because the world was devastated. But if you fast forward to 1990, when the Cold War is ending, all of a sudden, all of the advanced countries roughly have an economy the same size as the United States, a little bit larger. And when the Soviet system collapsed, rather than us having a good, deep conversation with ourselves about what we want to do next, what's the second phase of globalization? How do we remake the world? What's the world we want to leave for our children? We voted out the guy who wanted us to have that conversation, George Herbert Walker Bush, and we went with Bill Clinton, who was more populist, who was followed by George W. Bush, who was more populist, who was followed by Obama, who was more populist, and then Trump, more populist, and Biden, more populist. That's not an aberration. That's a trend. Americans have broadly lost interest in that sort of trade. And since the rest of the world kept getting all the goodies for free, Americans just became jaded. And so this president and our previous one are the two most populist economic leaders we have ever had. We've been backing away from it the whole time. And if you throw the demographic bomb on top of that, the model wouldn't have worked any longer anyway, because at its core, globalization is about trade, and trade is about consumption. And if you don't have enough people in their 20s and 30s and early 40s to do the consumption, none of the rest of it works anyway. So we were always going to get here. Trump sped it up. COVID sped it up. Biden is speeding it up. The COVID lockdowns in China are speeding it up. And the Ukraine war, honestly, is a bit of a hard stop. So we're here. We're not going back. Well, I'll definitely agree with you on social media because it's given every wackadoo a bullhorn that we can't tune out anymore. And so it does make more extreme views and more, God, I don't want to sound like elitist here, but relatively uninformed and unintelligent views dominate the information cycle, which is really frustrating for somebody like me who thrives on context. So I won't dive into that. You guys understand that completely. Let me give you two other reasons, though. One, globalization isn't free. It requires someone militarily holding up the ceiling of civilization. And since 1946, that's been the United States. And we're getting out of that business. As of January 1 of this year, I'm sorry, not January 1, as of February 21, the day before the Ukraine war started, the US had fewer troops stationed abroad than any time since Reconstruction. We're done. And so as we're having breakdowns in civil control of things like transport, the US just isn't there to protect it or pick up the pieces. And if you don't have broad scale transport, we're just not interested. And then third, we go through phases in the United States. We have a first past the post electoral system, which means you have to get one more vote than the next guy to get the seat. Well, that encourages the parties to be big tent parties because you have to throw as wide of a net as you can. But that means that the factions that are within the parties are always in motion, rising and falling within their party structures. And from time to time, due to changes in geopolitics or demographics or technology, you have a rupture when those factions just go hog wild and jump fences. We're going through one of those phases right now. We've had the rise of the baby boomers and now the retirement of the boomers. We've had the end of the Cold War, and now the end of globalization. We've had the rise of the information age. All of these are disruptive events to society, and all of them by themselves, any of them by themselves, would probably be enough to force a new political reckoning. And for them to all happen in basically the same window, wow. Honestly, it's amazing to me that things have been as settled as they have been of late. Now, we've gone through 6 of these political realignments before. And the last time we went through it, African Americans were to a person Republicans and big business were to a person Democrats. So it's awkward. Things that we think of as normal are now changing. And one of the reasons that everything seems so shrill is each political faction wants to make their issue the litmus test for loyalty for the new political alignment, whatever it happens to be. So look at the abortion debate in that light. Look at what's happening with organized labor. Organized labor strongly supported Donald Trump. Biden is trying to draw them back into the Democratic coalition. We will see if he is successful. Hispanics are shifting wholesale from left to right. This is all part of the process, and we will sort through this. Like I said, this is our 6th, or it's happened 6 times before. This is number 7. And it's always awkward and it's always painful and it's always loud. And now we have social media on top of that. And so the populists are absolutely having their day. Sure. So water is the cheapest way to move things from place to place. It's assuming you have an American style superhighway system. Moving things on water is still 12 times cheaper. And that assumes you're using big semis as opposed to like half semis. So the trick is always to figure out how to get population centers that are on the water to interact. And globalization made that safe. In the world before 1946, commerce was a target. State piracy was rampant, and you didn't have interconnections among economies. But by making the world safe for civilian transport, by meaning that you didn't have to get a national escort, we started shipping things that we normally wouldn't have. Especially when it came to the manufacturer's trade. Instead of shipping like finished vehicles, we would break up the supply chain into bumpers to spark plugs and everything in between, and it would be put together at different locations. You could have 30,000 independent supply chains that feed into a single vehicle. You couldn't do that in a world before a globalized, safe, secure maritime environment. And that required the US Navy. And it required the US Navy in an era where there really wasn't a competitor. So during the Cold War, yes, the Russians had their Navy, but they actually had four of them, one in the Black Sea, Baltic Sea, Arctic Sea, and the Pacific. And any one of them could not sail to reinforce the others. Whereas the United States basically had a continent to itself and could have two giant fleets, one in each ocean, and go and do whatever it needed to do. It was very easy to patrol everything. But in the time since the Cold War ended, the Chinese have had their rise. We have a number of other secondary navies that are building out. And the United States, since it didn't ever really care about the economic side of globalization, for us it was a security policy, we changed the way our Navy worked. And instead of having hundreds of destroyers, we now have 11 supercarrier battle groups of the vast, vast, vast majority of our naval power. If we wanted to go back to where we were in the 60s in a contested environment and patrol the global sea lane so that everyone could ship everything, we would probably need about 800 destroyers. We have 70, and half of them are assigned to protect the carriers. So there is no country, there is no coalition of countries any longer that can provide the security overwatch that's necessary to make globalization work in the first place. So it's just a question of where do we have the precipitating event or the complete collapse in security when that becomes obvious to everyone. We're not quite there yet. But let me give you some background and context here. So let's start with the military. We've spent the last 21 years basically fighting a series of wars in places that we have no desire in having a long-term presence any longer. We have designed our military to be personnel happy because we had to occupy countries. So we now have an army that is bigger and more capable in that field than we really have ever. And we now have to decide how rapidly we want to downsize that. If we want to downsize that, that's a political question. We are not yet having that conversation. But my friends in the military are going to be aghast at this. But with what I see as likely deployments, the Army is probably too big by about 2/3 right now. But decommissioning and downsizing that many troops that quickly costs more than maintaining them. I don't think so. The total standing forces are under 2 million. So I don't think that would be a big concern. And a lot of people serve their tour or do 2 tours, and then at the end of the tour, they go back to the civilian workforce. So my point is that downsizing the military sounds like a quick and easy fix. It's not. It's a decade process, just like it was in the 90s, the last time we did that. And you will not get meaningful savings until the 2030s.